Hello, thank you for being here. Today I will be talking about the Museo Mulalo in the Valle del Cauca department and how this institution has transformed itself from a museum strongly anchored in the national memory of figures such as Simon Bolivar into an Afro-Colombian and Black museum and vibrant cultural center. My focus is consistently on Mulalo, but are related to larger developments in the Colombian museum landscape, in particular the planned Museo Afro de Colombia in Cali. Mulalo is a prime example of how museums can become instruments of reparation, recognition, and social transformation when they are consistently designed with the community in mind. First, the guiding principle. Museums can serve as effective instruments of reparation and recognition of Afro-Colombian identity when they actively challenge historical narratives, amplify community voices, promote collective memory and healing, and advance social justice. The Museo Afro de Colombia in Cali aims to embody precisely that: community-driven, anti-racist, and decolonial. And Mulalo is a crucial reference for this, an existing community-based museum that shows how such an approach works in everyday life. What do these roles look like in concrete terms? As an instrument of reparation, this means, first, addressing historical injustices, from the transatlantic slave trade to segregation to structural racism. Secondly, it's about recognition and recognizing state responsibility, the economic benefits derived from enslaved labor, the racialization of the national geography, which reproduces poverty in Afro-descendant regions, and the supposedly neutral national memory that ignores Afro-Colombian perspectives widely. Thirdly, such museums address structural discrimination and institutional deficits that continue to have an impact from the past into the present. Fourthly, they demand epistemic justice, that is, a reframing of history in which Afro-Colombian perspectives and ancestral knowledge are systematically incorporated into educational curricula. As instruments of identity recognition, they do the following. They strengthen voices and narratives by no longer giving the floor primarily to specialists or dominant groups, but to the communities themselves. They promote collective memory, healing, and empowerment. Remembrance as a healing practice that helps to understand experiences of violence, including those from armed conflict. They break down stereotypes that reduce Afro-Colombian and Black identity to dance or exoticism and reveal its complexity. Leaders, scientists, politicians, spiritual beings with African roots and their own ways of relating to one another. Music and dance like curalao or champeta remain important, but exhibitions go beyond that, to cuisine and hairstyles that are deeply rooted in resistance and pride, and they foster a sense of belonging by bringing NOB communities, meaning negros y negras, afrodescendientes, raizales y palenqueras, together visibly across the country, encountering the notion that Afro-Colombians have barely their own culture that has grown in Colombia. How is this implemented? The vision, for example, of the Museo Afro de Colombia is based on a community-centered process, co-creation labs, high participation from communities, academia, activism, and social organizations from 15 sub-regions. Also, the headquarters are planned to be in Cali. The museum is understood as a network that cooperates with regional houses and places of Afro-Colombian remembrance. In terms of museology, it distinguishes itself from Western colonial object museums. People and communities are at the center, including the training of Afro-museologists by and for the Afro-Colombian and Black community. The first exhibitions focus on hairstyles as a sign of escape routes and cultural commitment, as well as cuisine as a bridge to culture, territory, and heritage. And you can see most of them in the National Museum of Colombia in Bogota. Music and dance remain present as forms of resistance and breakthrough racist hierarchies. Inspiration comes from, among others, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., which brings together diverse communities and their objects. Another national precedent for community-controlled narratives is the traveling exhibition El Vuelo de El Mochuelo. Of course, there are challenges in Cali. There's a danger of commercialization, that the museum will begin to function purely commercially. There has also been criticism when leaders do not come from the Black community. There are calls for genuine Afro-Colombian representation in decision-making roles. Some, such as Sergio Antonio Masquera from Muntu Bantu, take issue with the term museum itself because it's, according to him, elitist, distant, and alternative terms such as center of memory seem more appropriate to him. And symbolism alone doesn't change living conditions. Without material compensation and proactive policy against the causes of discrimination, the impact remains limited. Long-term success depends on lasting political will. Against this backdrop, the change in Molalo is particularly revealing. The Museo Molalo is located in an Afro-Colombian and Black community in Valle del Cauca, close to Cali, and embodies a fundamentally community-driven model of museology that challenges traditional institutions. Historically, national and regional museums in Colombia, say, think of the 19th century and nation building after independence. So they were places that consolidated the ideas of dominant groups. Museums such as the Casa Museo Quinta de Bolívar represent this Eurocentric master narrative until today. This one is located in Bogota. Afro and indigenous communities, small farmers, and landless populations were marginalized and stereotyped. Afro-descendant culture was long considered not independent, supposedly located only in Africa, and reduced to dance and exoticism in domestic discourse. So, Molalo today embodies the reversal of this logic. The shift away from heroic stories like those of Simon Bolivar towards Afro-Colombian traditions and identities is an expression of a broader project of reparation, recognition, and decolonization of cultural memory. In Molalo, the community is not an audience, but a protagonist and creative driving force. The house is a counter-discourse to the big museum that samples objects. Molalo focuses on collective subjects, grassroots organizations, and their right to a voice, memory, and their own history. The principles are clear. The Afro-Colombian population has the right to be seen and told from their own perspectives, not just through specialists. Central to this is the preservation of intangible heritage, like documenting, recording, creating spaces for dialogue, intercultural and intergenerational, in order to pass on practices, customs, and ancestral knowledge. In practical terms, this means participatory programming. Molalo organizes discussions between elders, children, and other community members. It offers theoretical and practical workshops on ancestral cooking and traditional practices. And it involves students from local schools in ongoing research processes, for example, in the form of oral history interviews with elders. The selection of topics, research, exhibition design, and the creation of narrative elements are the result of discussion rounds. The community interprets itself. What's more, Molalo has helped shape the Cali project. Its director, Esmeralda Ortiz Guerrero, is a member of the academic committee of the larger project of Museo Afro de Colombia. And Molalo played a decisive role in the debate about the future network. Why this paradigm shift? And why now? Several forces are at work. The 1991 Constitution defines Colombia as a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation and recognizes Afro-Colombians as a distinct ethnocultural group. This gives cultural institutions a mandate to contribute to reparation and recognition. The planned Museo Afro is conceived as symbolic reparation. It makes visible the continuing consequences of slavery, segregation, and structural racism, acknowledges state responsibility from the economic exploitation of enslaved labor, racialized geography to the neutral politics of memory that made Afro perspectives invisible, and links them to today's inequalities. The aim is to create equitable spaces of representation and fair historical narratives. At the same time, the new museology distances itself from object fixation. Western colonial forms by placing communities and people at the center and building up museologists by and for the community. The project architecture is deliberately participatory. It involves communities, academia, activism, and civil society organizations from numerous subregions. In terms of content, a wide range of practices are made visible, from hairstyles in Palenque to the escape routes and to cultural rebellion to cuisine as a deep connection to territory and heritage. Of course, this includes curalao and champeta as forms of music and dance that challenge racist hierarchies. All of this serves collective memory and healing, and it also addresses trauma from the armed conflict. This brings me to the broader question: how do museums transform social reality? Traditionally, institutions such as the Museo Nacional de Colombia consolidated the values of the elites in the 19th century. Today, new institutions like Mulalo and the Future Network around Cali are shifting toward diverse. They empower marginalized voices by being run by communities or involving them centrally. They act as instruments of reparation and recognition. They name historical crimes and link them to today's structures. They are spaces of collective memory, healing, and empowerment, remembering as a practice that makes anger and pain historically comprehensible and transforms them. They break stereotypes and promote inclusivity by making the other dimension of Afro-Colombian and Black culture visible, like leadership roles, science, politics, spirituality beyond reductive images. They create dialogue and education, for example in the form of exhibitions such as Hitos de Libertad, La Gente Negra desde el Museo de Todos los Colombianos, which addresses history, freedom, resistance, and racism, or traveling exhibitions such as El Vuelo de El Mochuelo, which make visible voices that were systematically absent from narratives of conflict, and they adapt their practices and attitudes away from object authority toward co-creation, participation, and the conscious relinquishment of traditional privileges. Community museums, such as Mulalo, function as dynamic, self-determined institutions. They are supported by the community, which acts as the protagonist and tells its story in a consensus process. They are a counter-discourse to the object museum and the focus on grassroots organizations' rights to voice, memory, and self-interpretation. They create spaces for the preservation and activation of heritage, material and immaterial, knowledge, beliefs, body techniques, and performances. They are founded in a spirit of resistance and work against subordination, disempowerment, and neo-colonization. They strengthen collective identity, promote self-awareness, and help to distance themselves from negative mainstream images. Remembering as healing. They work participatively on themes, research, scenography, and mediation, and they arise in joint labs, rounds, and workshops. And they address specific local needs and rights. The conversations between young and old, cooking workshops, student projects, oral history are already part of everyday life in Mulalo. In this way, museums become environments that respond to socio-political, socio-cultural, and socio-natural conflicts and build social resilience. At Mulalo, the decisive break was to retire the equestrian Bolivar display, a powerful emblem of Creole, elite national building, and to rehang the galleries around Afro-Colombian and Black local history. That curatorial act was not cosmetic. It reoriented authority, memory, and pedagogy pedagogy in the museum. First, it was symbolic reparation. By decentering Bolivar's heroic icon and centering enslaved Maroon and Afro-descendant lineages from Molalo itself, the museum makes violence visible, names state responsibility, and links past dispossessions to present inequalities. Retiring the horse and hero signals that Republican glory cannot eclipse the histories of those whose labor and suffering built the nation. Second, recognition and empowerment. Removing the equestrian focal point and the Simon Bolivar as a national hero created space for fair community-assured stories. Visitors now encounter the voices of Molalo's elders, women's groups, youth, spiritual leaders, not a single great man narrative, as it was before. This shift breaks the exoticism trap of reducing blackness to rhythm and color and affirms intellectual, political, and spiritual leadership from within the community. And then, challenging traditional models and stereotypes. Molalo moved from an object-centered reliquary to people-centered forum. This means perspectives instead of display cases. Everyday practices like cuisine, corralao, champeta are framed as technologies of resistance and historical knowledge, not folklore. Replacing the equestrian emblem and the focus on Simon Bolivar with these living practices reverses the gaze. The community is no longer a backdrop to national myths. The nation must now be read from life. And then there's preservation and transmission of material and immaterial heritage. The curatorial floor plan shifted from heroic memorabilia to intergenerational dialogue, like oral history with elders, ancestral knowledge of land, foodways, body techniques, and ritual. Museums archives now privilege voices, recipes, grading maps, songs, and testimonies alongside objects. So memory circulates and is teachable. And then therefore is of course participation and co-creation by and for. Programmatic heart of Molalo is workshops, co-design sessions in which themes, research, and exhibitions design are chosen collectively. Youth train as docents and researchers, and capacity building forms future offer museologists. The curatorial decision to remove Bolivar's horse and his history from the museum is emblematic of this governance change. The community sets and there's also education and healing. Galleries were reimagined as spaces of collective memory where segregation, dispossession, and aporophobia are analyzed along. By programming against silence with panels on land laws, rooms for testimony, pedagogy around racial capitalism, Molalo enacts as discursive reversal, meaning reversal of oppressive discourse. Injustice, violence, and inequality are named, contextualized, and taught. This aligns with national current, for example, in Museo Nacional initiatives and traveling informants. But Molalo's distinct contribution is community authorship as the rule, not the exception. And one more aspect to sharpen the content: when museums reclaim narratives, they do not only do so with Colombia in mind. Internationally, figures such as Harriet Tubman represent resistant genealogies that lie beyond sanitized images, as a bundle of strategies, tools, and sacrifices. Such references help to make resistance and self-empowerment visible in Colombia, a central axis of Afro-diasporic history. In Molalo, the path from a house that previously stood in the logic of national master narratives, symbolically Bolivar, to an Afro-Colombian and Black museum and cultural center is a double break. First, epistemically away from Eurocentrism toward community knowledge. Second, institutionally away from object toward the person, away from the authority of the display case toward the shared authorship. In practice, this means programs with elders and children, workshops on everyday cooking and technology, students as researchers, oral history as curriculum, collective theme selection, and self-determined exhibition design. Mulalo is thus not just another museum, it's a laboratory for what the Cali Museum, referring to the Museo Afro de Colombia, wants to become on a national level, a hub in a network of Afro-diasporic memory that not only displays but also learns, heals and acts with communities. Of course, vigilance remains necessary against commercialization, against tokenistic representation, without power sharing for genuine Afro-Colombian and Black leadership. The question of the name. Museum or Memory Center is also more than semantics. It concerns belonging and accessibility. And symbolism needs material things, reparation requires resources, politics, legislation, and long-term will. So for now, I conclude with Mulalo's perspective. Museums transform social reality when they move from being archives to being actors. When they amplify voices, rewrite narratives, active heritage, enable healing, and demand justice. Mulalo shows how this can be done as a community-driven institution that not only exhibits the past, but also renegotiates it in dialogue with the present and the future. This is precisely the meaning of change, from the memory of Bolivar to Afro-Colombian and Black self-representation. And this is precisely where the power arises.